being called a rat by an ex-wife, but I don't think she was being anatomically quite correct. She was talking about my personality, I think. Understanding the phylogeny of species allows us to study the behavioral and neural adaptations that allowed animals to exploit particular ecological niches. And we talked about this with canines. Small canines like foxes eat small animals. Large canines like wolves and coyotes eat large animals. They don't occupy the same niche. The other thing about canines is that small dogs are singular hunters and large dogs are pack hunters. So they have different personalities. Now the odd thing is that if you have a dog, your dog is a pack animal. Your dog is a domestic dog, and they tend to be, well, some of them are really small, but most of them are dogs about the size of a coyote and the weight of a coyote. So your dog is a pack animal, and if your dog ever runs away and into the wild, he will join a pack, or she will join a pack, whichever the case may be. They will pack. So their personalities are, and one of the reasons they like us is because they are naturally drawn to other creatures. They are drawn to other dominant and subordinate creatures. So if you have a dog in your house, and there are 4 or 5 people in your house, that dog considers itself a member of that pack, of your group, as bizarre as that may seem. So that's the way their minds work. They are pack animals, and in order to, and you have to determine who is the leader of the pack. Now normally it's a human, and normally, and it all depends on how deep a voice the female member of the family is, but if it's usually the adult male in the group, and so he can say something to the dog, and if he says it in a mean tone, the dog will do what he wants them to do. This happens with my dogs. I have 3 dogs and a wife and a daughter and a grandson, and if the dogs start doing something that my daughter doesn't like, she gets this high-pitched voice, and they don't listen to her at all. And my wife's the same way. If she gets irritated with something, her voice gets really high. But when I yell at the dogs with a deeper voice, and the dogs do exactly what I tell them to do, because that's a dominant voice. And they're pack animals, so they do what you want them to do. Except I had a 200-pound dog. This dog was huge. And he was a dog, you know. I weigh 185 pounds, he weighs 200 pounds, and he's got, you know, lots of nice teeth. I could yell at him and he wouldn't do what I told him to do. So he thought he was a dominant member of our pack. Comparative studies may focus on specific differences between closely related species, or may be concerned with general principles across larger numbers of species, but in each case, the use of evolutionary framework provides additional explanatory power. And so that's what we do. We look at all of the what am I thinking of? We look at the monkeys and the gorillas and the chimpanzees and the humans, and if we compare their behavior, we get a taste of how humans have evolved. That's what we're thinking about anyway. And of course, I don't have this thing turned on. There we go. All right. There we go. Okay. And so there we are. This is us, but we're related to the rat as well, and that's one of the reasons why we do a lot of experiments on rats. We used to do a lot of experiments on chimpanzees and monkeys. We don't anymore. They're too close to humans, and people feel bad about it because they're almost human. And the truth is, they're almost human.
Yeah.
So they act almost human. The principles of neural function revealed by comparative anatomy studies may often be generalized to many species and of course, including humans. So if cats act a certain way, or chimpanzees act a certain way, or rats act a certain way, then we can assume, or we speculate that humans in our evolutionary past, this is part of who we are. It's kind of interesting to look at the great apes. If we look at, and look at their reproductive anatomy. Males always have penises and testicles, of course. If we're looking at a chimpanzee, chimpanzees have huge testicles. Their penises aren't all that large, but their testicles are massive. And the reason they're massive is because their reproductive technique is for the female to have copious sex with a lot of different individuals. So in order to be the sire, or in order to be the parent of an offspring, you need to produce a lot of sperm. And so that's the way they do it. Gorillas, on the other hand, maintain harems, and their testicles are relatively small. And the reason they're relatively small is because they don't compete with anybody else for reproductive rights. So when they copulate, they will be the sire of the offspring, of whatever comes out, because that's just the way it works. Okay, so where are we in this whole mess? You know, are we do our females, do human females have sex with a number of different males? Do we need large testicles like the chimpanzees, or do we not need large testicles like the gorilla? And this is a question that I mean, these are questions that we have had to answer over time. Why do some women mess around? Why are there some men that think they want to reproduce with everybody? Who was it? Wilt Chamberlain, who had sex with over 10,000 women. What was his point? What was the idea? Why in the world would he do something like that? Is this normal reproductive behavior? And the answer is, well, society has told us that we need to be monogamous. But are we more like chimpanzees, or are we more like gorillas? Should we maintain a harem? I mean, there are individuals that do maintain a harem in the human species, but if we look at our evolutionary past, at gorillas and chimpanzees, what we see is we have both techniques, and potentially that is part of who we are. That is the most, I like that example, because it's very demonstrative,
yeah,
of who we are and where we may have been, and where we may be going in the future. It's interesting to watch reproductive techniques of humans and how it works. Some men are completely monogamous, and other men are not even close. Some women are monogamous and some women aren't. But is it society that dictates that, or what would we be doing if society didn't tell us how to do this? And of course, it's really interesting, because if you wander around and you talk to, and you look at different areas, or you look at different tribes in the United States, you know, what were their reproductive techniques? What were they? How did they do this? Did males have more than one wife? In the Midwest, in the forested area of the Midwest, a lot of it was matrilineal, and the women owned everything, and the men were they just kind of went from village to village, or they lived in the village with the woman, but the woman owned the fields. She owned the grain. All he owned, and she even owned his weapons. The only thing that he owned was if he killed something, then he got a portion of the deer or whatever he's
how about
killing.
I don't know if, like, how polygamy comes into play. Is that the same, or do you think it's religion?
Polygamy? Polygamy is very common among American Indians.
Yeah.
Especially the Plains Indians, because they had to butcher buffalo. And since you needed people to do that, I mean, you needed family members to do that, so they had multiple wives. I think you guys had multiple wives too, didn't you? Have you guys always been monogamous? The Navajo, I mean.
I don't know.
You didn't know?
This is like the first one on my culture since I've been here.
Well, we'll have to ask Wilson.
Yeah, probably. I'm not too sure about that one.
I'm not too sure either. I mean, since you didn't have the butchering necessity that the Plains Indians had. The group that I was telling you about, that's a Shawnee is who I'm talking about. The Shawnee were really kind of interesting because they would have villages and the women would be in the villages, and if she were married to a male, then and he were coming into camp, he would have to tell her that he's coming into camp because she might be with another husband.
Mm-hmm.
So they were polyandrous. They had more than one husband.
Yeah.
Okay. And it all depended on where this guy was. So the men kind of just wandered around between villages, and they had different wives in each village. So, but the wives had different husbands as well. So he would have to indicate to her that he was coming into camp, and if she had another husband there, she would either tell him, well, come on in, or, stay away. Stay away until, I'd rather be with this husband than with you. So it was really kind of an interesting situation.
So you don't think that has anything to do with religion then, because of?
Well, it didn't have anything to do with their religion,
Oh, okay.
but you're talking about your Christianity.
Well, it's
Or
like how you're
Muslimism.
talking about the whole monogamy and not monogamy type of thing, especially with animals too, how, like animals, obviously they never.
They
don't
don't get
tie.
married.
Yeah.
But they do kind of. If you will see animals that only breed with select other animals. So are they married or are they not? The male will stay with the female for an extended length of time. Some animals, the male helps raise the young. Not all animals. A lot of times with puppies and kittens, the female will breed with the male and then the male has to go away. Because sometimes in order to have, to get to breed again, he will kill the offspring. Of course, if there's a new male that comes in, they will kill the offspring so that they will have other puppies and kittens. So yeah, it's that's really interesting. Is it a religious thing? And the other question was religion based on reproduction?
Yeah.
Did we create religion so that we would there would be rules about reproduction?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know. I don't want to speculate.
I don't either. I just
I was doing guard in Afghanistan, and I was talking to our interpreter. Now, how many kids you got, man? He was all 17. How many wives do you have? 4.
4.
I was like, God dang, dude.
If you can afford it. I mean, that's the way it is in some countries. If you can afford, if you can take care of all of those children, you can have as many.
But he had like a lot of land. He was
Sure.
He was.
Yeah.
Over there, he was well off.
Sure.
Over here, maybe not so much.
Well, not with 4 wives.
But he had about an acre of land out there. That's
Sure.
quite a bit of freaking land.
Yeah.
Well, that's, anyways.
Right.
a lot, yeah.
Yeah. Relatively common with Muslims.
Yeah, because like my sister and her husband, my brother-in-law, they've been married for 30 years and they have 10 kids.
Okay, that's a lot of kids.
Yeah.
Okay, he must have a good job.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. When I was living in Omaha, there was a young lady, she just turned 22, and she had 6 kids. But he was He
She
was
turned
wealthy.
22?
She was 22 and she had 6 kids.
Wow.
Yeah, they started really young, but, yeah, well, they started really young. But the point was, and it was really kind of interesting, she was only 22, and here she had all these children, but her and her husband were very wealthy, they lived in a mansion. It was one of those kind of deals. So they
Yeah.
were trying to repopulate Omaha, obviously. And they did a pretty good job. But they had lots and lots of money. It's not like they were just popping out children and they didn't know whether they were gonna feed them beans or cornbread for supper.
Yeah.
The major divisions of the brain are varied by all vertebrates. Brain differences between species of vertebrates can often be directly related to their ecology and behavioral complexity. So it all depends on lots of things, on how much thinking they have to do in order to survive. If you're talking about living in a very cold climate, there's a lot of planning that has to take place. One of the reasons Eskimos have, or not Eskimos, but the Aleuts and the Inuits, the people that have evolved living in a very cold climate, these individuals have to plan everything. They have to know what's going to happen tomorrow. They have to plan for blizzards and whatnot. They have to plan for potentially I won't be able to go out and hunt for a month, so I need that much food to store. If you live where I live in Iowa, anything will grow there, and you can just produce all the food that you want. But of course, if we have harsh winters, relatively harsh winters, I would imagine it would be even more difficult here, where things don't grow nearly as well. So you have to start accumulating the food for the winter and early in the summer, and then just keep accumulating.
Yeah.
And that has to do with your flocks and whatnot, and the number of livestock that you have. Such differences tend to be quantitative in nature. Relative size of brain regions or the size of neurons is a good example. Because we are humans and because it's not as easy for us to survive as other animals. I woke up this morning and there was half a mouse on the floor right in front of my bed. I didn't eat it, it's not mine, it was somebody else brought it in. It was either the cat or the dog brought it in, I have no idea. But they'll eat, yeah, so it looked good.
Pretty much share.
It's always nice to share. So those animals, I mean, I wouldn't eat a raw mouse. Well, maybe I would, I don't know. I've never been in a situation where I was that hungry. But if they have access to rodents and they're very good at catching rodents, they don't have to worry about food. If I'm not willing to eat half a rodent, then I'm in kind of a world of hurt.
Would you eat bugs?
I've eaten bugs before, but I didn't want to.
In SEER school, we had to eat bugs.
I know, we did too.
Actually, some of the bugs, I was talking to another maintenance guy, he's an army vet too.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are pretty good. I'm like, yeah, a little bit of salt, pretty decent.
Salt. That's the problem, they don't taste salty enough.
I had, it was 2 years ago at the state fair, I had deep fried chocolate covered grasshopper.
Ah, how was it?
It's good.
That's popular in Europe. The Swiss and even Germany, they have like ants, caterpillars, the little bugs, the beetles.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's a delicacy over there.
I just wanted
But
to
of course
try.
you can't taste whatever it is, the bug, all you're tasting is the chocolate. And
It was actually nutty.
nutty, okay,
Yeah.
well, that makes sense. That's the deep fat fried part. Was it deep fat fried in peanut oil?
I don't know. I didn't ask.
There's your-
Probably,
That's
but
your
it,
nutty flavor. Right?
maybe. I only had one though.
Okay. You didn't have a whole plate full of.
No.
For supper tonight, we're going to. The field of classifying animals is known as taxonomy. Taxonomy is an ongoing endeavor. Taxonomy can be done in many ways, including paleontology. Paleontology, of course, is a study of fossil remains. So we can look at who we are and where we have been by looking at the fossil remains of other humans. Comparing animal DNA with human DNA, we do this a lot, especially, well, this is very common right now. Oh, you got friends.
Oh, we could.
We have to go.
Let me go say hi to her really quick. Sorry.
That's okay. Putting paleontological information with DNA analysis in a study called convergent evolution. This is really kind of interesting. We're doing this right now, convergent evolution. We have been trying to isolate Neanderthal DNA so that we can compare Neanderthals with modern man. Neanderthals, I'm going to show you some pictures of Neanderthals in just a second. Neanderthals are a group of individuals who are more evolved than we are, potentially. They had bigger brains than we did, than we have. We being modern man. And this is known as convergent evolution. We've been trying to figure out where Neanderthals fit in for a really, really long time. We discovered Neanderthals back in the 1840s. We discovered fossils of Neanderthals. So one of the things that we have been trying to figure out is where the hell did they come from? And where do they fit in? And why have we digressed? Why have we regressed? If we were smarter 13,000 years ago when Neanderthals were around, what happened to them? Why did they die out and why did we survive? This is a question that comes up all the time. Now the problem is, I'm starting to squeak. The problem is that people don't want to think. People want to think that we are continually progressing, that we're not moving backwards, that we are. People don't want to think that we're not the smartest things that ever have been. We want to think that we are going to continue to get smarter and smarter and smarter. So they can't fathom the fact that maybe in the past people were actually more intelligent than they are today. And when I say the past, I'm talking about a mutation back in the past. So if we look at Neanderthals, we see a whole niche, a whole mass of people with very large brains, much larger than what we have. So we're still trying to figure out where they fit and why we are different than they were. Why don't we have larger brains than Neanderthals? But we don't. We have smaller brains. And this is known as convergent evolution. We have just recently been able to isolate some DNA from Neanderthals, so that we could look at various DNA structures of modern man to find out if they still exist in us, in our DNA. And the answer is yes, they do. But there are only select groups of individuals that have Neanderthal DNA. If you're a European, if you have a European ancestry, yes. It gets kind of complicated. If you're an American Indian, yes, you have Neanderthal DNA.
How about the Native Americans in Canada, you think
Yes.
so? Eskimos, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah?
The only people that don't seem to have Neanderthal DNA are the Africans living in Africa today. They don't have any Neanderthal DNA. But theoretically, I mean, if we look at Neanderthals, they were not in Africa. They had already spread out over the world, and they weren't around for very long. Eventually, of course, Cro-Magnon man, the modern man, ate them. I don't know. They disappeared. We have found Neanderthal remains that it looked like they had been butchered, which means somebody ate them.
Yeah.
So cannibalism is not that uncommon. I mean, it hasn't been that uncommon. But was it other Neanderthals that were doing the cannibalism, or was it modern man they were killing these people that didn't look like them, and then they ate them? We don't know.
That's interesting.
I know this is fascinating. I love the whole study of Neanderthal DNA. for a couple different reasons. I had an uncle that looked like, you know, the mock-up of Neanderthal man. He looked exactly like that. So I figure I've got a lot of Neanderthal DNA. Two of the fastest swimmers in the ocean are tuna and dolphin. Now you can see that dolphin have vertical
The tuna?
stabilizers. Yeah, and dolphins have horizontal rear fins. Their rear fins are horizontal. So they're very much different, but they're both very, very fast swimmers. They've evolved to be efficient swimmers, obviously, dolphins and tuna. However, the dolphin, of course, is a mammal. It's not a fish at all. And the tuna, of course, is a fish. And they don't look, well, they kind of look alike. And these guys are worth a lot of money. Yeah.
I seen that show where it's really,
Well, it's insane.
I
The
know.
Japanese will pay anything for tuna. Similar features due to convergent evolution is called homoplasy, similar development, and of course, so they developed in a similar manner despite the fact that one's a mammal and the other is a fish. Homology, a study of similarities, looks at similarities between body structures of animals with common ancestry. A good example would be the homology of the forelimb of several mammals. You can see the human arm and the human hand, and how that is almost identical to the leg of a dog, or the flipper of a seal, or the wing of a bat. They're all mammals, and they all have upper appendages, and those upper appendages are identical, even though they don't look the same. Why? Well, this one swims in the ocean, this one walks on the land, and this one flies in the air. And for that reason, despite the fact that they all do different things, they all have identical structures. This is known as analogy, where you analyze things like this. So if you had a veterinarian and he was working on dogs and horses and whatnot. The hooves of horses, what is that? Just what are the hooves of horses?
I don't know.
Horses are, I mean, we could put a horse here and their hooves would be toes. That's what it would be. And unfortunately, of course, hoof is a fairly interesting structure.
Yeah.
But all the nerves have to feed into the hoof, just like carpal tunnel. So horses get carpal tunnel,
yeah.
but it's called navicular syndrome, where the opening is too small. We had a horse that had navicular syndrome. Its hooves were too small for its body, and so well. It was in a lot of pain all the time. So what do you do with a horse with navicular syndrome? Well, you cut that nerve. But the problem is they can't feel their hooves as well as other horses can. So they stumble a lot. That was kind of weird.
That is weird.
We couldn't ride it. We couldn't ride the horse.
You got all the other horse. Come out.
So we shot it. No, actually we didn't. And the reason we had it is because the person that had it couldn't ride it, and so he didn't want to shoot it, and he didn't want to put it down, so he gave it to us so that it could live on our property. We had 20 acres. This is up in Montana. And so it just kind of wandered around. It was a mean horse too. It was mad. It was angry because it hurt. You know, its front hooves, it hurt because of the navicular syndrome. Classification of species begins in general terms and runs to more and more specific terms. So we start off with Animalia, or that is the kingdom that we live in. We are animals, just like insects are animals. There are 5 different kingdoms. Animals, that's us. Plants, we're not a plant. Fungi, we're not fungi either. Monera is bacteria, and Protista is slime. So, you know, that red slime you find in the ocean every once in a while, that's Protista. And there's actually a lot of this stuff out there, this slimy stuff. It's not a bacteria, it's not a fungi, it's not a plant, and it's not an animal. It is slime. The main subdivision of the kingdom is your phylum. 3 phyla are Chordata, Mollusca, and Anthropoda. We are, of course, are Anthropoda. We are anthropods. The main subdivision of a phylum is its class. Some classes within the phylum of Chordata is, I'm sorry, we're not anthropods, we're Chordata. Is Mammalia, Aves, and Reptilia. Reptilia are reptiles, Aves, of course, are birds, and Mammalia are what we are mammals. Main subdivision of a class is an order. Some orders within the class of Mammalia, Carnivora, Herbivora, and Primates. We are primates, of course. And we're also herbivores and carnivores. Well, some of us are. Some of us are just herbivores. Some of us are just carnivores. A meat eater. The main subdivision of the order is the family, such as Canidae and Felidae. Canidae, of course, are dogs, and Felidae are cats. The main subdivision of a family is the genus, such as Canis and Vulpes. Canis, of course, are dogs, and Vulpes are wolves. The main subdivision of the genus is the species, such as Canis familiaris. That would be the domestic dog. Canis being dog, familiaris being domestic. Member of the family, domestic. Anyway, so there you go. As much fun as all that is. There are 8 species of Canis, wolves, jackals, coyotes, dogs. It leaves out foxes, of course. While Darwin's theory was widely accepted, no one really knew or understood how change could take place until Hugo de Vries, the biologist Hugo de Vries, looked at primroses. So he raised primroses, and he proved that they would change over time. And sometimes they change. Of course, primroses grow relatively rapidly. So what he discovered was sometimes they just spontaneously mutate. Most of the mutations aren't any good. They destroy the structure. But other mutations are adaptable. A famous mutation of humans is eye color. Once upon a time, and it wasn't that long ago, 10, 15,000 years ago, all humans had brown eyes. And then there was a mutation. One individual, a select group of individuals, people started having blue eyes. And it worked. It worked in certain places better than it worked in other places. It didn't work very well in Africa, where it's so sunny all the time. It didn't work in Africa. But it did work where it was cloudy all the time. The reason that you have brown eyes, the reason that brown eyes are a good idea is because it filters out the sun better. So if you were someplace where it didn't matter whether the sun were filtered out or not, then blue eyes would be okay. During the day, brown-eyed people see better than blue-eyed people. During the night, blue-eyed people see better than brown-eyed people. As bizarre as that sounds. Maybe it's not that extreme. But if you were a blue-eyed person in Africa, then potentially you would go blind because the sun was so bright at some point in your...
How about people with other colored eyes, like green or hazel?
Green and hazel are just mutations of blue.
Okay, so we have the similar traits as blue?
They have exactly, yeah. They came from blue-eyed people. If you have a blue-eyed person, my wife claims she has gray eyes. Drives me crazy. She has blue eyes, okay? But sometimes they're gray. I had a girlfriend one time. I probably shouldn't talk about my girlfriend. I had a girlfriend one time who had one brown eye and one blue eye. And when she got excited, her eyes would change to brown. So she had, sometimes when she was mad, well, not mad, when she was relaxed, both of her eyes would turn blue. I mean, it was the most bizarre thing in the world. You could read this lady just by looking at her eyes.
Yeah.
So her eyes would actually change colors. So you could,
It changes with her emotions?
with her emotions, that's
Wow.
bizarre as that is. Because it would send more blood to her eyeball, and the iris would change colors. Most people's eyes don't change colors, but hers did. It was really weird. It's really strange. If you look at somebody's eyes, if you're around somebody all the time, my wife sometimes really does have gray eyes, but usually when she's mad. Almost everybody's eyes change color, but of course, if you've got dark brown eyes, then it's really hard to tell the difference between whether it's darker today, at this moment, than it was, 15 minutes ago. But if you've got blue eyes or an eye color that, and if you look at people's eyes, which most people don't.
Yeah.
Okay. We usually look at people's mouths to determine what they're thinking. That's strange. But the Japanese do. Now, the Japanese look at your eyes, but the Japanese all have dark eyes. They all have brown eyes. Since Americans went over there for a while, there are some blue-eyed Japanese, but they're not very well accepted by other Japanese because of the way the Japanese are. They're very, very ethnocentric. They're xenophobic,
That's,
far more than we are.
mhm.
98% of the people in Japan are Japanese. They couldn't be the United States because they don't, if you're not Japanese, they don't accept you. They've got all kinds of horrible names for you. Kind of like Belagana, okay?
I don't think.
Ask somebody what Belagana means.
I know what it means, but
What does it mean?
white person.
I don't think that's it.
No, it means something else.
Means that people it has something to do with the people that won't go away or something like that. Ask Wilson or Amy.
Yeah, this.
I never heard it in that context before, but
Well, I mean, it has a meaning. It's a word.
I don't know. Well, yeah, I probably have to ask
I
them,
think
but
it's
I never thought it
I think it means
was
like a person
a
who
bad
always wants to fight,
thing.
or something like that.
That's usually what, yeah, see, that's what
Yeah,
Comanche.
because that's what I learned it from Wilson. I took his Navajo psychology class. That's what I learned it from.
Well, I'm not really with my Navajo culture. I don't really
Yeah.
practice it,
It's
so.
not really important. I'm just making a point. Gaijin, of course, is the word that they use for somebody who's not Japanese. Gaijin means, it literally means the person that sneaks in the window at night.
Mhm.
Okay. As curious as that is. So, I mean, is that a compliment or an insult? If I'm sneaking in the window at night, am I a good guy or a bad guy?
Ninja.
Yeah, it all depends on how much sneaking you enjoy. Okay.
Yeah, like some people may think that's a good thing, and some people may see it as. a
I don't see sneaking in the window at night ever as a.
I know, but like the context of Billigana, like I didn't think it was a bad thing, but apparently the
No, I
way
mean,
they.
I'm sure it's evolved over time.
Yeah.
It may have started as something else. Comanche, the word Comanche is a Ute word that means the people that want to fight. Actually means the people that want to kill us. That's what Comanche means.
Isn't it,
They don't call
Navajo,
themselves Comanche.
like Raider or something? Like
sorry?
Navajo meant raiders or,
Yeah, thieves.
yeah.
The horse thief.
Yeah. Yeah. Sioux means enemy.
Mhm.
You know, almost everybody's name means enemy. I mean, the common name for them. The Comanche call themselves the Numina,
Mhm.
which means the people. The Nez Perce call themselves the Nimepu, which means we the people. Okay. But of course, Nez Perce means pierced noses.
So it's like Navajo when you say Dene people.
Right.
Yeah. They just have two different,
Sure.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I just say Native American all around, I mean,
Which is Very demonstrative.
Yeah.
Genetic studies subsequently demonstrated that chromosomes provided the building blocks of inheritance. We discovered this in the late 1940s, early 1950s. We discovered it in the 1940s, but we didn't accept it until the 1950s. Later, genes were identified as the building blocks of chromosomes. This is Watson and Crick. That's Watson and that's Crick. They demonstrated that DNA was arranged in a double helix made up of nucleic acids. So our DNA comes from the people that we are, the way that we look, the reason that we look this way, the reason that our eyes are blue, that our hair is black, that we're 7 feet tall, is because of this double helix. You got your genes from your mom and your genes from your dad, and they tied each other together. They tied at the right places, so that you would have 5 fingers and you would have 5 toes on each foot, 5 fingers on each hand, 5 toes on 5 toes, only 1 nose, 2 ears, the whole thing. It had to tie together perfectly, and that's the way it works. It's like a magnet. It draws itself to the right places. If it didn't do that, then we would have all kinds of strange mutations. If we had a hole in our DNA, if we had an open spot in our DNA, potentially that would cause a mutation. And we see these kind of instances from time to time. XO syndrome for females, where they only have 1 X chromosome and the other chromosome is empty. These individuals never mature. They will not be able to reproduce because they won't be able to, they don't mature. So they don't ovulate, and if they can't ovulate, then they can't reproduce. Men who are XXY, they can reproduce, but they have an extra chromosome. Whoops, they have an extra XYY, I'm sorry. They have an extra Y chromosome, which makes them hypermale. And it does all kinds of real interesting things. They don't learn as well as XY people. That's a male. They are taller. They have different musculature. They have a lot of acne, as weird as that may seem, but it has to do with the excess testosterone that they put out. Really they have distended testicles. Just all kinds of interesting things. Anyway, so our DNA ties together in that manner. The sperm and the ova, of course, got to get the DNA from the sperm and the ova got together, and they formed a perfect DNA. Now, the interesting thing about DNA is that, well, it's not that interesting, I guess. We had never seen a picture of it. We had a theory about it. This is in the 1950s. And we weren't able to actually visualize it. This is actually a picture of a rat DNA, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But we couldn't visualize it until the 1960s, when we invented the electron microscope. And one of the first people to visualize this was a friend of mine at my college. I know, I was really excited. And he's a multi-millionaire today because he worked with genetics and he invented things like tomatoes that lasted longer, tomatoes that worms didn't want to eat. So he invented all these, Franken tomatoes things. He worked with tomatoes, oddly enough.
How about people that are I heard of that people that are autistic.
Okay.
Do they have an extra chromosome, or they?
No, they have a chromosomal structure. It turns out that autism and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are on, it's the same structure. ADHD is part of this whole mass as well. So the most extreme form is autism. Mm-hmm. And then the less extreme form of this chromosomal structure is schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. And a less severe form of this is ADHD. Okay, it's all on the same gene. It's all in the same gene structure. They theorized about this a long time ago. Well, I know some individuals that were working on this, but they couldn't prove it. I mean, they had no way of proving it. The problem with schizophrenia is sometimes it's conditional. I mean, it's conditioned in an individual to act that way, and then they are diagnosed with schizophrenia, but they don't fit in the pattern. But there are some individuals are born with this proclivity. If certain things happen to you at the right time, it triggers schizophrenia. If it's triggered at birth, it's autism. Turns out to be autism. And of course, the autism spectrum disorder is, I mean, there's a lot of different types.
Yeah.
It goes all the way to Asperger's syndrome, where you can't tell if they have a problem. So it really all depends. If something happened to you, if you, something happened to your brain, then potentially you developed schizophrenia. You had the flu at the wrong time. If you had brain trauma. Some people are kicked into, if you take drugs, methamphetamines will kick somebody into schizophrenia. What else kicks? Marijuana. It affects your brain.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so it's kind of traumatic to your brain. We know that cocaine will kill you if you have a heart condition. And the heart condition doesn't even have to be obvious, but sometimes it just affects the heart in that way. The same way with the brain. And so sometimes if an individual is using a drug that traumatizes their brain, like crystal meth or cocaine or marijuana, then possibly it will kick them into a psychotic situation. Some women, when they have a baby, will be kicked into psychosis because it's the mixture of all those hormones. You know, progesterone. You got to have this huge mass of progesterone. You have a higher level of estrogen. It will kick them into psychosis.
Okay.
Postpartum psychosis. They never come back. They will be psychotic for the rest of their lives. But you can't trust them around children. They kill them. I know. As ugly as that is.
That's interesting.
I know, so we got all this stuff going on, and it's kind of cool. It's kind of cool. The more trauma you've had to your head, the more likely that you'll develop any of these strange problems.
The reason why I asked is because my nephew, they classified him as autistic.
Okay.
And they said something about his chromosome, but my sister didn't really
Understand
tell
these
me
things.
details about
course.
it. Yeah. So I was like,
Yeah. Yeah. If somebody is autistic, they usually diagnose them within the first 2 or 3 years of life. Normally what will happen normally what will happen is we assume that they're going to be normal. Okay, so we're looking for abnormalities, and every time one of these abnormalities comes up, then we go, well, maybe they're autistic, but let's not diagnose them yet. And then they wait until it's obvious that this individual's not functioning properly.
he's in 6th grade now, and
Okay.
so they just recently found out this past year that he was autistic.
Is that right?
Yeah, because
This late?
they noticed that he was not learning as fast as the
Okay.
other students, and that his personality, he tends to draw himself more to kids that are younger than him, than his age or older. And he has like this really high protective instinct about the younger kids that are around him.
Jeez.
And while they didn't know from kindergarten to 5th grade, and then when he got into 6th grade this year, that's when they started noticing all those little things about him. Because he wasn't as catching up to the other students
Right.
as, you know.
Does he
when
interact normally with?
He interacts with people he knows, but people that are younger, he draws himself
He's
more
drawn to them, but
to them.
isn't everybody drawn to younger people?
Yeah, but people in his class, he secludes himself from everybody else.
Okay.
The only person that he really listens to you. Like when you tell him to do something, and then you tell him again, and then another thing, he doesn't remember the first thing you told him, but he remembers the second thing you tell him.
So he doesn't start listening to you until you told him twice,
Sometimes 3 times, yeah.
3 times, okay. Well,
And
that's
then
interesting.
he'll be like, wait, what did you want? He'll remember the second thing, but he won't remember what you said to him.
See, in the old days, we wouldn't have diagnosed him with autism.
Mhm.
We would have diagnosed him with probably Asperger's syndrome. But they changed it with the DSM-5.
Yeah,
Yeah, with the DSM-4, he would have been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome.
yeah. So my sister.
So he's a high functioning.
Yeah.
He's very high functioning.
Yeah, so my sister, the only thing she does is now takes him to like a speech therapist
Okay.
and also a counselor, but she drives from Teeth all the way to Flagstaff,
Right.
just so that way she can have good therapists for him, yeah.
Why would he have a problem with his speech? There's a logical answer to this question.
That's what I don't know what it is, like, they just keep telling me that it's something with his chromosome that
Well,
is
that
affecting
doesn't have
him.
to do with his chromosomes.
That's what I mean, I'm trying to figure out what they were talking about.
If you have to say everything to him at least twice, and sometimes 3 times, then he's not listening like, as you and I are. You're
Yeah.
listening to what I'm saying, so you're hearing what I'm saying.
Mhm.
But if he were sitting there, I'd have to tell him twice.
Mhm.
Even if he was paying attention or if I thought he was paying attention the first time. So because of that, he isn't getting the same speech pattern that other people are.
Yeah.
So that's why he has a speech impediment,
Mhm.
to whatever degree it is. Is it a certain sound, or is it just the fact that he doesn't pay attention?
He pays attention. He does.
Well, no, he doesn't, because he doesn't hear you until the second or third time you tell him something.
But that's the thing is, when that started occurring, it was only with not, how would you say, not like with certain people, but then like,
Right, people he knows he pays attention to.
Mhm.
Okay, people he doesn't know he doesn't pay attention to.
he just
Right.
like blocks it out, I guess you could say.
You're on your phone and you're watching television and your mom tells you that supper's ready.
Mhm.
Okay. You don't hear her, even though she just told you, and you said, yeah, okay. Because you're on your phone and you're watching television at the same time, so you're not really paying attention to her.
Yeah,
Okay. So you don't come to supper until she tells you again.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but she started noticing all those little things about him and.
Right, but he does that with everybody. He does that especially
I
with
think
people
so.
that, people
Yeah.
he doesn't know. Okay, as fascinating as that is.
Yeah,
I wouldn't diagnose him with autism, but that's me, okay?
yeah, I don't really think he is either, but
Yeah.
at the same time, you know, she's,
There's a reason why they're diagnosing him with this.
yeah, I don't know the
It's
whole
for the,
story.
it's for the future. It's for the future. But I mean, if he were just sitting at home, nobody would care, because he pays attention to you guys.
Mhm.
And he pays, and he's really good with kids,
Yeah, he really is.
because he wants to protect them.
Mhm.
Should become a policeman. Today, the Modern Genome Project gives us an ever-expanding view of the makeup of humans as compared to other creatures. And as we know, that we did the Genome Project and we looked at the chromosomes of chimpanzees, 98.6%, 98.4%, sorry, is identical. So if we were trying to tell the difference between the two of us, it's not anywhere close to 1.6% of this whole entire genetic structure. 98.4% we don't even have to look at, because that's exactly the same as a chimpanzee. So as humans, we are very, very close to each other genetically, no matter how disparate our ethnicity is. Humans have still only been around for about 1 million years. We haven't had that much of a chance to mutate.
Mhm.
Okay. All humans were identical, were almost identical in the beginning. And then as we moved away and started filling other ecological niches, Europeans went into up where there was a lot of ice, where it was cold, where it was cloudy all the time. they evolved a little bit differently. The individuals that stayed down in Africa, they evolved another way. The people that went over into Asia, they evolved in another way.
They evolved according to their environment.
Well, they were looking, everybody's looking for food. Everybody wants to be fed, and nobody wants to starve to death. So we have changed, and the reason that, white people are white, I'm not that white, but the reason white people are white is because they need to process vitamin D. We all need to process vitamin D in order to grow bones. So the sunnier it is, the darker complexion people are. That has to do with all of this whole evolution thing. When we started covering ourselves better, we didn't have to worry about vitamin D. We didn't have to worry about what color our hair was, what color our eyes are. White people, when they go to Africa, they have to cover themselves up because they sunburn so readily. If they lived out in the Arizona desert, they would have to cover up because they would sunburn so readily.
Yeah.
But you guys don't hardly sunburn at all. You turn brown.
Corey gets sunburned.
Oh, Corey's got too much pale ancestry.
No, it's just, I don't know.
Yeah, sure you do. She has too much pale ancestry. Or her ancestors, she had some ancestors that were very pale. Maybe some Scandinavians or something. Maybe they were redheads. And so her skin is pale.
She doesn't go out in the sun. She stays inside. I want to stay home. Okay, that's boring.
I don't want to turn red.
For me, I get dark, like in overseas. Oh man, I was almost black. Well,
Not that dark.
no, but we had to though. We had to grow out our beards.
Right.
Black because we were SOCOM, so we had to.
You had to look like the Afghans.
Yeah.
Yeah. With their goofy hats.
And my dresses.
Researchers have determined that species who have to hunt for their food, such as humans and carnivores, have bigger brains than animals who don't have to search for their food, such as ungulates. And if you look at the ungulates, of course, look how tiny that deer's head is. It always amazes me that this animal that's 200, 300 pounds has this tiny little head. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Talk about a pinhead. Or sheep. Sheep have tiny little heads as well. Yeah. Why? Well, they eat anything, and they eat whatever's on the ground. They can survive in just about any environment, so they'll eat anything. They don't even have to think about it. If it's poison, they don't eat it. If it isn't poison, they eat it. So, and of course, goats are so bad. But humans, of course, we have to eat the right things, and we have to get it in certain amounts. If we don't get enough vitamin B, if we don't get enough vitamin C, then we get scurvy. All of these things. We have to really think about what food we're eating. The more novel the means of obtaining food, the larger the forebrain of the animal. Magpies have been known to dig up potatoes. This is a magpie. House sparrows have been seen picking insects from car radiator grills. That's a sparrow. And crows, of course, the one on top, have been known to drop rock-hard palm nuts in front of cars that run over them and open them up for the crows. So these are animals, and they think. They have to think. These animals have larger brains because they in order for them to eat, they need to use novel means of procuring food. Birds who store food will have a larger hippocampus than birds who don't. The hippocampus is necessary for memory, and thus a larger one is needed for these species that rely on memory for survival. This is an acorn woodpecker. This is a Clark's nutcracker, and that is a black-capped chickadee. And these animals will store food for the winter, so they have to remember where they are. They have to remember where their food stores are, and that's one of the reasons why they have such big hippocampi. In order to drive a taxi in London, you have to know all the streets of London. Well, it would be easy if everything were square, but nothing is square in England because London was built in concentric circles. So sometimes streets will change their names, kind of like going to Albuquerque. Half the time you're driving down the road on the left, the street will be one thing, and on the right it'll be something else. That's because Albuquerque was built in the same way, in concentric circles. It grew out from a central core. And because of that, there are neighborhoods were built. And of course, those neighborhoods had roads that are not square. In the United States, we're used to things being square. So if you go to Indianapolis, if you go to Minneapolis, if you go to, not St. Louis, don't go to St. Louis. If you go to Denver, Denver was platted. It was plotted. They figured out this is what a block looks like, and
Yeah.
everything is relatively square.
It's really easy to get around it.
Exactly, exactly. If you go to Germany, of course, Germany was not put together that way. Germany is built around mountains. So a lot of times if you go, in the United States, if I get lost, I know that I can turn left and I'm headed west, I'm headed north. So if I turn left, I'm headed west, and then I can turn north again, and then I can turn east, and then I can come back the same way I was going, because all the roads are square. Everything is platted. Everything is in a rectangular manner. All the fields in the United States are relatively square. But if we go to a Europe where the fields may be any different shape, then sometimes the road goes around the mountain. So if you can't turn left and keep turning left and go back to the same spot. If you do that, you're going to get lost because all of a sudden you're going around a mountain instead of going where you thought you were supposed to go. Why am I talking about this? Oh, I'm talking about London. So London is the same way. London was built, it started as a little bitty village, and then it just kind of grew in concentric masses. So the streets in London are a mess. So in order to be a cab driver in London, you have to memorize all the streets in London. And London is fairly extensive. So the individual, and these people will study for years, memorizing street names and memorizing where they are. So they know that if they turn left here, they're going down, Budweiser Boulevard or whatever. They know that this street goes for 4 blocks, and then it turns into Windsor Avenue, those kinds of things. And they have to memorize all this stuff, this huge map. They have to memorize the entire thing. These individuals have huge hippocampi. These are humans. These are individuals who are cab drivers, and their hippocampi are massive. And the reason that they are is because they have to remember all of this stuff. So they have large hippocampi. Now the interesting thing about taxi drivers in London, they very rarely come down with Alzheimer's disease. It's very rare for them to come down with Alzheimer's disease. Why? Because they're using their brains all the time. People that develop Alzheimer's disease, this isn't absolute, of course, but a lot of times the people that develop Alzheimer's disease are the people that they don't think. They don't use their brains a lot. We discovered this when we were looking at a group of nuns in Wisconsin. It was a whole group of nuns, and they lived in a convent. The nuns who cooked and the nuns who cleaned and the ones who tended the garden, all of these individuals developed Alzheimer's disease. The individuals that were teachers, the ones that were in charge, these individuals didn't develop Alzheimer's diseases, especially the teachers, because they were constantly, even into their 60s and 70s, they were teaching. They had to go into the classroom and teach. Well, these other individuals, they did the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over again. If you make bread, it's always the same formula.
Yeah.
Okay, so they didn't have to do a whole lot of thinking. And those are the ones that developed Alzheimer's disease. So what they're telling people now is to keep your mind active. Even into your 70s and 80s, what you need to do is do puzzles and whatnot. My mother lived to be 98 years old. She did the crossword puzzle every day. Okay. Every day. And she was lucid up until about 6 months before she died. She was really active, and she could do she wasn't very good with the pencil anymore. So she didn't make her A's, she didn't put a cross on her A's, she just made one of those things. I know, it was really weird. If she made an F, it was, just up and over, she didn't make the cross, it was kind of weird. So going behind my mother and finishing her crossword puzzle was a bit of a trick, because you had to figure out what letter she was trying to write. And she complained about new things. She hated Fellowship of the Ring, that whole trilogy.
The Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings, yeah, she hated that. She hated Harry Potter. Not because it didn't have anything to do with Harry Potter, but she never read the books. So she had a lot of questions about Harry Potter and about the Lord of the Rings. And of course, she'd never read the books. She didn't like the books because she'd never read them. Okay, you know that.
Yeah.
Okay. So she couldn't answer those questions. So she would call somebody on the phone. She'd call one of her grandchildren up, or she'd call me up on the phone, or my brother up, and ask us about, the Lord of the Rings. Well, who was that guy? It was Frodo or Bilbo. It's usually Frodo or Bilbo, or Ents. That was in the crossword puzzles a lot. The differences between the brains of humans and the brains of other mammals are mostly quantitative. We have big brains. Rats and humans are similar in that each has a brain that represents about 2% of our total body weight. It's about 3 pounds. The basic differences have mostly to do with the size of the cerebrum of the human and the prominent increase in surface due to the gyri and the sulci. So we have a lot of convolutions in our brains, and that's why we're so damn smart. If we look at a gorilla's brain, if we look at a rat's brain, you can see how smooth it is, no convolutions. But the human brain, of course, has lots and lots of convolutions. And that gives us more surface area. And because we have more surface area, it makes us more intelligent. Once upon a time, they would do this. They would cut the brains out of people. They would leave their brains to science. And everybody wanted the biggest brain. Everybody wanted, the heaviest brain.
Monkey's brain's about this big.
What, monkey's brain, yeah.
I've seen it firsthand. I've actually ate it.
Ah, okay. I was going to ask you if you'd eaten monkey's brain.
Yeah. Salty. Very salty.
Yeah, I know. It's not the best flavor in the world. Anyway, this is us, and this is the rat. We look at, if we compare, this is a chimpanzee, this is a human, and that's a rat again. Rats don't miss out completely, of course. Their olfactory bulbs are much, much larger than ours are, so they can find food, whereas we can't. As humans, our olfactory bulbs are very, very tiny. And the reason is because we don't pay attention to smells. So we don't need them. They have atrophied in the human. And it may be that our olfactory bulbs are so small. I don't know. I have a really acute sense of smell. Why I have an acute sense of smell, I'm not exactly sure. Maybe it's because I was born on a farm and there weren't very many smells around. And I lived, we lived in a forest. We weren't around smog. We weren't around exhaust because we lived in a fairly pristine environment. Maybe that's why my sense of smell is so acute. I have a sister that lived in Chicago. She moved to Chicago. She got married and moved to Chicago. Her sense of smell is almost non-existent. I can tell if something is cooking in the oven, I can tell when it's done. Drives my wife crazy, because she can't. She burns everything. But I can tell her if it's done. And I'm fairly accurate. I don't even have to be paying attention, and I'll tell her when something's done, if she's cooking something. Drives her nuts. And sometimes she'll come up and say, do you think that's done? And I won't, I'm sitting half a house away from the food, and she'll ask me if I think it's done. Or it will smell done, and I'll tell her, I think your pie's finished. I think your rolls are ready. She hates that. No, it's not time yet. It said, right.
Following the timer.
You better go by my smell rather than your timer. You're gonna burn everything. The nervous system of vertebrates have several similarities. They develop from a hollow dorsal neural tube. They show bilateral symmetry. There's one on each side, bilateral symmetry. They're equal on each side. Segmentation is present. Pairs of spinal nerves extend from each level of the spinal cord. The central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system are separate. Localization is present. Certain functions are controlled by certain locations in the central nervous system, and these are how they compare. Anthropologists and comparative biologists assume that all vertebrates have these features in common because they descended from common ancestors. Vertebrates are another story, of course. Invertebrates, of course, are another story. There's 17 phyla to cover the invertebrates, while vertebrates are only one. There's only one of us. It has been estimated that for every human on Earth, there are 1 billion insects. Ouch. Hopefully they're not like swarming around you all the time, 1 billion insects. All those fleas, all those mosquitoes. I hope they're not mosquitoes. The basic plan, all vertebrates and most invertebrates share a basic plan that consists of a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, of course, the brain and the spinal column. Everything else is the peripheral nervous system. Well, if we look at a grasshopper, the one that you ate,
Yes.
exactly the same thing. How the brain stays. Salty is how they taste it. All brains taste salty. There's a lot of fat.
Really?
That's what brains are made out of. Fat. Well, they're made out of neurons. All vertebrates and many invertebrates, including mollusks and insects, have brains. The central evolutionary trend in both vertebrates and invertebrates is toward increasing brain control over ganglia at lower levels of the body. And of course, this is the brain of the grasshopper, and this is the brain of Stewie, I'm sorry, who is very, very intelligent and speaks with an English accent, as weird as that seems. Neurons of the mammalians, axons of the mammalians, neurons are surrounded by myelin, which helps them conduct impulse faster. Invertebrates have no myelin to speed nerve conduction, but then again, they're not very big anyway. If we look at present creatures and their fossilized ancestors, we can see that the brain has changed over time, whether it is a bird's brain or a hominid brain. Making a cast of the inside of the skull to map the brain is referred to as an endocast, and this is how we have determined how these other hominids, how their brains were structured. We can make a cast of the inside of their brain, of the inside of their skull, as curious as that is. Now, you guys being Navajos, you've never seen this stuff, but of course I did, because that was one of my jobs as a lab tech. Doing autopsies was one of the things that we did. So I saw a lot of these things. A skeleton would come in, and we would look at, we try to do, well, if a skeleton comes in, the first thing you have to do is identify it by whether it's Caucasian or African or native or whatever. Now, oddly enough, we can tell just by looking at your skull what ethnicity you are, because each ethnicity has different shaped skulls. Women have different shaped skulls than men. The male forehead is more up and down than the female forehead. The female forehead is more slanted. But not all males are alike. But males tend to have bigger heads than females do. Anyway, not important. There we go. See, as you can see, the Neanderthal man has a bigger brain. And this is the one thing I wanted to show you. Neanderthal men there they are with their big brains. They're so much damn smarter than we are. Or they would be, except they're all dead. What happened to them? Who killed them?
Who ate them?
I guess that's the question.